So we are stuck in a rut. It's a rut that's shaped like this. It doesn't seem to matter whether you are a prestigious international news organization, or a local newspaper, or a tabloid newspaper, or you're selling clothes, or running a church, or talking about sports, or broadcasting a podcast, or distributing films, or traveling the world, or teaching graphic design professionals. You're stuck in this rut. Or I know I am totally oversimplifying. Some of us are stuck in this rut. When did this become the thing that you are supposed to do in web design layout? I don't know. That pattern started originally when blogs were hot, and when we went from 640 pixels wide on the screen to 800 pixels wide on the screen, and people realized, smart people, that we didn't necessarily want to make the text go all the way across. Having longer and longer lengths of text is bad. It's better for typography for the text to stay short. So there was this extra space. And do you remember when the extra space had really cool stuff in it? You'd spend a lot of time. I spent hours and hours on people's sidebars, clicking on every link in that sidebar, going back through the archives, checking out other people's blogs in the blog roll. But these days, really the only thing that you should use a sidebar for is when your boss makes you put something on a website and you don't want anybody to ever see it. No one ever looks in the sidebar. We've spent the last 10 years training people to never, ever, ever look in the sidebar or on the top of the page. And we could do anything we want. We have this blank canvas. It's a computerized, digitized, animatable, fancy blank canvas. Or I should show you this, of course, right? Responsive web design. We have all these different sizes of screens, different kinds of devices to cover. So what are we doing with responsive web design? We're doing a lot of this. A lot of big hero graphic all the way across the top, center of text going down the middle, which is great. Get rid of the cruft and the crap that's in the sidebar, simplify things, make things more readable, work on beautiful typography. As an industry, we've really focused on typography. Or a lot of this. I mean, I remember The Great Discontent came out, and I was thoroughly impressed and incredibly jealous and very, it's gorgeous. But I think as far as the layout, you know, it's very, very simple. It's very, it's just sort of leaning on the conventions that we've been having for the many years. I think a lot of people think that this is what responsive web design is. Responsive web design is just moving the sidebars around. Right? I know big debates in whole content management systems about how exactly best to make this be responsive web design. But that's not all that we can do. We're also seeing a lot of this kind of thing. I think there are other trends emerging where there's kind of a single column of content going down the middle of the page, delineated by these breaks of color, a band of color, or some kind of horizontal line. This kind of thing. I think it's really very fascinating. If you've ever opened up a PDF in a web browser and you start scanning, your brain just sort of automatically flips into another mode where you're going, oh, it's a PDF, of course. It's a page and scroll, and it's another page and scroll, and it's another page. And I think that bands of color, or panes is what I've been calling them, panes are the new page. You don't have to necessarily have people click a link and go to a different web page. They can stay on the same web page and sort of have this experience of going through one page and another of content by scrolling through these panes. I think that's a very interesting and very helpful trend. But a lot of what we're doing with those panes is designing incredibly rudimentary, simplistic designs inside those spaces, as if we have no idea what to do. We're babies all over again. We'll make it into 3 things. We'll do 3 things in that one, and then we'll do 2 things. So we're seeing a lot of this. Have you seen this was going around Twitter? We're unique. Find out how unique. Always 3 columns. You could have 4 columns, but you don't. You have 3. And we're seeing a lot of backlash right now. Oh, responsive web design makes everybody do exactly the same thing. It's like, it's not responsive web design's fault. It's our fault. We just happen to be doing exactly the same thing. You don't have to. Remember when things used to be much more punk rock? Remember when this was the original design pattern? This was one of, when I first got on the web, this was the predominant design pattern in layout. Do you remember? Who remembers this design pattern, right? Like, This is the original layout pattern of the web, the no layout layout. Because there was nothing that you could do to create a layout on a web page. Your web page was going to look like this. It was going to have a gray background. Everything would be left justified. It's amazing. This is the first e-commerce website, Pizza Hut. You could still go to that website. It's still up. Yahoo. We started to get a little bit of layout when you could align things in the middle. You could do text align center, or what in CSS is text align centered, but of course this is way before CSS, so I don't know, what was it, font, something, something, something? I blocked it from my memory. But then this was one of many patterns that came along, Space Jam. Or here's the original Microsoft homepage. We liked circles. 1-800-Flowers. Shop our store, enter our garden. It's a space, it's cyberspace. Come on in. We put text on an arc, Hall of Shame, the Netscape Hall of Shame. Or this is a classic example of navigation. All of those objects in that drawing are links. You could click on the couch and go someplace. Or you could click on the lamp and go someplace else. You don't know where you're going. It's cyberspace. It's an interesting adventure. Apple's first homepage. Jeffrey Zeldman's first website that he talked about this morning. This one is a little bit more familiar to us, right? Because this is what we're seeing, this kind of old patterns coming back. You want to see another one? The old becomes new again. The most fascinating thing to me about the Apple Watch is its use of circles. There's circles all over that interface, even though the object itself is a square. The designers focused on making circles inside that square. It seems so radical these days. We're so stuck in this box, 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 box way of thinking. Here's a very rudimentary technology being used, but look at that diagonal line across the page. Because the first thing is left justified, and the middle one is centered, and the bottom one is right justified. It creates a diagonal line. Oh my gosh. Hot wired. Remember hot wired? You change all the time. Wired monkey, web monkey. That's how I learned how to do websites. I like this design from hot wired because the objects, it's familiar in that there's 6 columns. Each column is the same width as the other columns, but the height of the columns is staggered. They're not aligned at the top. It seems so radical. So why did we have these kinds of layouts? We had them because we were using tables to do layout. And here's an example for those of you who weren't there, kids today, if you missed this era. We would use these tables that had these ugly lines, but you could go in and set the border to be 0, and they would disappear. So here I am hacking back in and setting the borders back to 1, so you can actually see the tables. There's 4 tables, one nested inside of another, inside of another, inside of another, inside of another, in order to do this layout. It's very fragile, very hacky, very hard to do, but you could do all kinds of crazy things with that layout. And so we got all kinds of crazy things, like running horses in a circle for the BBC's coverage of the 1997 election in the UK. Here's Space Jam with the table borders turned back on. The medium shapes the medium. And the fact that we had no tools for layout gave us one set of layouts. Then when we got tools, those tools sort of shaped the kinds of layouts that we made. We changed the tools very radically. We got another set of layouts. And I've been wondering, where is it that we're going next? Because we're about to see a renaissance in layout design on the web, because there are a whole bunch of new tools coming that will let us do very radical, very different kinds of designs. So where is it that we want to go? I've been thinking about this question a lot. We don't want to just keep copying the layouts that we've had. We want to do what's newly possible with this technology. And I've been thinking a lot about the fact that there is a world of graphic design that is older than the web. This is Anna Wintour sitting in the middle there. She's the editor-in-chief of American Vogue magazine, probably the most powerful person in the fashion industry. Vogue magazine does these incredible photo shoots where they spend a lot of money getting models and photographers and clothes and building sets and lighting and flowers, and they go kind of crazy making these fantasy photographs, and then they put them in their magazine in these very beautiful layouts. Here's just a simple, you can see the text up in the upper left-hand corner. That's the magazine spread. Or here's another one with a headline and a longer paragraph. little bit of a caption on the side. Beautiful layout. The focus is on the photograph. There's a documentary about Anna Wintour and the making of the September issue of Vogue, which is their biggest issue every year. This year's, I don't know, I bought one finally. I'm not really into fashion, but I should buy the magazine. It weighed a ton. I was at the airport. The woman was like, could you have bought a heavier magazine? In this documentary, they're going in and out of this room, putting together the magazine, and everyone who's working on it is thinking about the magazine as a print publication, not thinking about the web. And they're doing all this work to create the articles. They're sending them off to production. They're getting these little miniature copies of the layout back. They're putting them up on the wall, and they're looking at it. They're rearranging the pages. They're figuring out, oh, no, this article's not working. Let's get rid of it. Let's add one here. Let's rearrange the order of the pages. They're conceiving of the experience for their readers as a print magazine. And then let's see what happens. After the real magazine is done, they poop out that content onto the fastest growing distribution medium ever created in the history of humanity for reading and sharing content. It's so powerful that it is, in fact, destroying the print industry. Let's see what Vogue.com looks like. Vogue magazine. There we go. There's the main landing page for Vogue magazine last June, a year ago. Where is the magazine? Well, OK, let's pretend the thing on the top wasn't actually there. This is the main page. Where's like the heart of the magazine itself? Like, OK, it's not at the bottom. I guess it's sort of here. That's Vogue magazine. Well, so let's click on the picture of the model and the bear and see where we go. This is, OK, again, we're going to pretend that the thing on the top didn't happen. I think there are 4 navigation bars here, and the content's surrounded by ads. But again, let's set that aside. Let's just look at the layout of the content itself. We get the headline with the name of the photographer, and then we get the name of the photographer a second time. Then we get the share links, because those are most important. They really need to go first. We get this photo that is fairly small on this huge page, and the tiny words that you probably can't read that say, see the slideshow. Then there's 3 sentences. The first sentence is about this set of images, and the next 2 sentences are trying to convince you to leave before you actually see anything. So let's click on the see the slideshow, you get this. And then click on the bear and the model again, and you get this. This is on an iPad. If you ever worked in photography, professional, especially fashion photography, real photographers back in the day cared very deeply about shooting on slide film and looking at the slide on a light table through a loop. They really considered that to be the best and most authentic way to see the photo that they shot, because you would see the light come through the slide and into your eyeballs directly. By the time you printed it onto a piece of photographic paper, it had kind of lowered in quality. And by the time for sure that you printed it in CMYK on magazine paper, it was very much like nowhere near the reality of that photograph. The iPad is much more like a light table. We're delivering these photos to people in the most gorgeous RGB color space, light going straight out of the iPad into their eyeballs, or other tablets, other phones, other computer screens. So why are we delivering it like this? You should be able to pinch and zoom and see the bracelets and the clothes and the makeup and the shoes, and it should be the best way to experience Vogue magazine ever. Where is this version of Vogue magazine on the web? It's just not there. These people are at the very top of the industry doing the very best work of their lives to have it presented like this. So why, right? Why is that happening? Of course, you've been in that meeting. We've all been in those meetings. A lot of meetings gone wrong. But I can tell you for sure one thing. Every single person in every one of those meetings went in with this underlying assumption that you're making a website, it's got to be shaped like this. We're not even going to back up and ask a question of why. I'm here to tell you that's not true. You don't have to make it shaped like that. People might be saying, well, what about the ads? The ads are the cause of all the problem. We do have a problem with ads on the web. This is 3 screenshots that Merlin Mann put together in a photo set on Flickr that he named the noise-to-noise ratio, where the white areas are the real content that people came to the web page to see, and everything that's grayed over is everything else that is getting delivered. We have a problem with ads on the web. But you know who else has a lot of ads? fashion magazines. Fashion magazines are mostly ads. That giant copy of the September issue that I bought is probably 80 or 90% ads. It's crazy. But the ads are valuable content. The ads tell the story of fall fashion 2015 as much as any of the rest of the content does. People buy the magazine knowing that they're full of ads, and they're happy about it. Look at that graphic match up in the corner. We've got these butterflies in the ad, and then you've got these shirts on hangers right next to it in this butterfly shape. That didn't happen by accident. Somebody art-directed that into existence. There's some sort of craft and care going into the way that this was put together that just isn't making it onto the website. Layout should serve the content, and we've forgotten that on the web somehow. So let's look at some magazines. Let's look at some print design. I honestly can't believe that I'm traveling around this year saying to people, hey, let's do better web design by looking at print. Because me and so many of us spent so many years, spent at least a decade trying to convince everybody that the web is not print, and you cannot carry over ideas from print onto the web. The web is a different medium. You have to understand it as a different medium. Stop thinking that the web is print. I still believe that very much. But I also do think that it's time. The web has matured enough for us to look back at some of print and figure out what we might have left behind that we want to use. So look at this. I just searched online for experimental magazine layout, image search, and grabbed some images and put them up. I think they're interesting to look at. The way that that poem wraps around the letter G. Or here, all of these text flowing around these different shapes. Here's another one, kind of weird shapes of things shaped around other shapes. This one's a bit more mainstream. You know, what if you could do this online? You could do the RGB, the translucency there with RGB from CSS3. You can do the web fonts now. It's been about 5 years you've been able to do these things. Well, what about that text wrapped around that elbow? Yeah, you know what? You can totally do that now. There's a thing called CSS Shapes. Let me show it to you. So I was working on the website for the web ahead last winter. This is sort of half-baked. Took these screenshots while I was working on it in progress. Jeremy Keith, a guest on the show, there's name, and is it wrapped up in an H1, an image, and a paragraph. Just apply some simple CSS. We're going to float the image to the left, put a little bit of margin around it. That's what we get, right? Like, you've seen this now for whatever bazillion years. That's what normally we get. Let's add one line of code. Shape outside, circle, and this is what you get. It wraps the text around in a circle. It's called CSS Shapes Level 1. That spec is in candidate recommendation, and it's pretty well supported. It's in Chrome, and it's in Safari, including iOS Safari. So basically the most popular desktop browser and the most popular mobile browser in most markets, most audiences. So it's about 50% of people have the ability to look at CSS shapes. And that's OK that it's only 50%. Because why? Because here's the finished website, the web ahead. This is what it looks like in Chrome. Nice little wrap, the text flowing around in a circle. This is what it looks like in Firefox. It's fine. No big deal. Actually, I like this design. I would not have come up with this design if I wasn't designing for CSS Shapes, actually. And it works just great. And someday, Firefox will totally support shapes, and then, oh, people will think maybe the website changed. It'll be fine. Shapes can do a bunch of stuff: circle, ellipse, border box, inset, URL, shapes margin. You can check these out right now at labs.thewebahead.net. Click around. You can get to this, the demos that I'm showing you right now. There's also a link there that goes to the GitHub repo if you want to fork the repo and pull it and play around with that code. Here's ellipse. You can also make ellipses and not just circles. Here you can, I've made the image, I've given a border radius, and you can do shape outside border box, and then the flow of the content will match the border box for the actual page. And as I change the size of the border radius, it will change the way that the flow is happening on the curve as well. You can use URL, which is a really great thing to do for content management systems, I think. That way you don't have to actually write the CSS for that particular image. You can write the CSS to look for a mask, and you could get your content management system to set up a mask itself. So in the HTML, it points to that regular beehive image, and then there in the CSS, it's going to point to a mask. this mask here, right? And so anywhere there's white, it puts the words. Anywhere where there's black, it avoids and doesn't put any words. So you get this result. It's pretty nice. Here's a polygon. I just found a cat that happened to be sort of shaped like a diamond. And that polygon code, those 4 numbers, make 4 points on a diamond. There's a plugin for CSS Shapes editor for Chrome that you can use, a tool that I'm about to show you that's pretty awesome. So here I am. I'm going to inspect this element. And you can see there's the image. And I'm going to go over and turn on this little tool. This gives you this little tiny arrow. It makes your browser pretend that it's Illustrator. And it puts a line, a dotted blue line, around the cat. And with the 4 points, you can see the points. And then you can grab those points and you can drag them and move them around. And you can see what's actually happening, how the words are flowing around the shape that's in the CSS. You can add more points using this tool, mess around with it. And of course, if you're doing some sort of bespoke one-off, you can just grab the code right out of the editor there and paste it into your CSS. This really gives you a good idea of what's going on, how it's actually working. It's pretty radical. There's a show, episode 81 of The Web Ahead, where we talk about CSS Shapes and a lot of other things with Sarah Swedon. Check it out. There's also some really great show notes. All the things I just showed you, there's links to those things in the show notes. So look at this magazine layout. This queue, the content itself is actually inside the queue. Or here, I mean, look at that graphic match with the staircase and the slant on the... I'm here to tell you that you can put text on a website in a shape that's not a rectangle. What we would like to do is draw the trapezoid and pour the content into the trapezoid. That will have, you can do that later. But right now, so shape level 1 is shapes outside. Shapes level 2 is a spec that they're working on right now, where shape inside, where you define a shape and put the content inside. That's not coming soon. That will come later. But meanwhile, you can do things like this, where you sort of draw the white space and tell it to avoid the white space to get kind of the same result. So let's look at some more magazines and some more possibilities. Here, they're using text as a very graphic element on the page in a bold way. A little bit of tilt adds quirkiness to this, a feeling of frivolity, perhaps? I don't know how to describe this. It's crazy, right? Pushing the envelope into unreadable land, but just let's cleanse our palette for a minute and realize that there's other stuff that we haven't even thought about. The rotation on here just makes it more dynamic. Here, the headline being rotated, it just adds a sense of movement to this page. A bit of polish, perhaps? We can do this on the web. We talk about transformations and rotation a lot when we're talking about animation, but you don't have to animate something. You can simply rotate it and let it stay still. Transform, rotate negative 10 degrees, takes that column of text and rotates it negative 10 degrees. Or here, I just rotated the headline to make it go sideways up the page. Or here, I floated the headline. It's a little weird and hacky, but I did that so I could combine it with CSS Shapes and make a polygon. I also wanted to make sure that everybody understands what's going on with media queries. It's easy to think, oh, everyone gets responsive web design. But a lot of us are outsourcing our understanding by using frameworks. And we're sort of using responsive web design on the whole page. But we aren't necessarily using media queries in little places to make adjustments as needed. So here's a simple example. This column of text is just a main element. And I gave it a width of 300 pixels. And then that next statement, it says at media, min width 500 pixels. It's basically an if statement. It's saying to the browser, if the browser window is at least 500 pixels wide, then please do the stuff in these parentheses. And in this case, that means make the background of this main element red and give it a transform of negative 10 degree rotation. But if the browser window is 700 pixels wide, then I want you to make it green and -20. And if it's 900 pixels wide, then I want you to make it blue. Oh, I want you to make it a little wider, make it 400 pixels, and I want you to put it -30. Right? So it's a simple example, but it's basically saying to you, any of the stuff I'm showing you, or really any of the stuff ever when it comes to styling a web page, you can do those things conditionally only at certain sizes of screen. So you got some fancy rotation shapes thing going on, but sure, only do that at big screens, and at the small screens, you don't need to do that. So here's this in action, right? So it's just, you're just making, as the browser is wider, you get different results. You don't have to have all your media query stuff in some special media query world separate. I put media queries right in the middle of my CSS all the time. Like, oh, this thing is cool. Oh, except not at this size. Oh, yeah, and then not at this size, right? Just toss them in wherever you want them. Putting salt in your dinner or something. Transform, rotate. It's part of this specification, the transform specification. It's very, very well supported. You can totally use it now. Could have used it 5 years ago. So let's look at some others. This, of course, something that's incredibly important to magazine design. I love how old this is. And how completely different this one feels. But these are all using columns, columns of text. It's hard to think about magazines without thinking about columns of text. So what can we do about columns on the web? We don't really we just have one column all the time. This is one possibility. Multiple column layout, multi-column, is a spec that's been around now, also for a while. Let me show you how it works. So this is what we get if we have nothing. This is just flexible, fluid web design, right? Nothing going on. The line length just gets longer and longer and longer. This is a typical responsive web design, right? What do? We cap the line length, and we center the text of column, the text in the center. That's what we've been doing a lot of. You can get that by doing a max width of 500 pixels and then putting margin on it, margin 0 for top and bottom, margin auto for the sides, and it puts it in the middle. But if instead of doing that, let's put column count 2 on the article and a column gap of 2m. And this is what you get. We get 2 columns. And not only do we have 2 columns, but the content is flowing from one column into the other. And if we add a paragraph or we remove a few words, it will rejigger it and recalculate it so that those 2 columns are always the same height, which is something that browsers haven't done before. But with responsive web design, you don't really want 2 columns the whole time, right? You're going to want 1 column and then 2 and then 3. And you're thinking, oh, well, I'll write a bunch of media queries. I got to write, OK, so at this size, I want 1 column. At this size, I want 2 columns. Yeah, that's too much work. You don't want to do that. Ethan will talk about this tomorrow. We want to be lazy. So instead, let's say column width 200 pixels, which means, hey, browser, I kind of want my columns around 200 pixels. Can you please just figure it out? And the browser's like, OK. And at one size, it will do, it goes from 1 column to 2 columns to 3 columns. I think this works really well for content that's about this amount of content. You could be using this today on your website and have columns. There's a couple other things you can do with it. I tossed an image into this example, and I added a column rule. You can tell the browser to draw a vertical line between the columns of text. It's just a nice little detail. It's not a border. It's a column rule. And I also want you to see that the way the image is, it just flows into different places, so it's in the right place. It doesn't cut the image in half and put one half on the bottom of one column and the other half. That's what happens when you print a web page. But multi-column layout actually handles this pretty well. There's the code for that. Multi-column layout is a spec. It's very well supported as well. It's not in AE 8 and 9. I'll talk about those kinds of things later, but you can use it today. The lighter gray is about not supporting some more advanced attributes that I didn't talk about, but the stuff I talked about is all well supported today. The question that I have, though, is what do we do when we have longer amounts of content? I was surfing Twitter, and everybody's talking about HTTPS, and should we be using HTTPS everywhere, and blah, 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 security, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, oh, I should read that article. And I click the link, and I land here, and I go, oh, right? You know that part of you that just reacts to something before you've even thought? I'm just like, what an idiot. This person clearly laid out their well-thought-out security article in Microsoft Word and exported it as a PDF and put their PDF online. Don't they know that you're supposed to just put content straight on the web, not put PDFs on the web? Yeah, look who wrote this. Tim Berners-Lee, he's the dude who invented the web. He knows not to put PDFs on the web. He invented the web specifically for this use case of putting documents on the web. And I realized in that instance, that's multi-column layout in action. I'd never see multi-column layout in the wild. Here it is. The problem, though, is I don't know if this is a problem or not. What happens when you read this article? You're thinking about HTTPS and security certificates, and you're reading the left-hand column, and you get to the bottom. You got to scroll back up to the top and then read down the right-hand column. I don't know if that's actually going to be fine and not a big deal, because it's easy to scroll these days. You just flick on a piece of glass, whether it's a trackpad or it's actually the screen itself. It's really not that hard to scroll. It's not like back in the day where you had to click, 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 on the little wheel, click, click, and your finger would get tired. Yeah, those days are over. So maybe it's no big deal, and users will figure this out. Or maybe this is a big deal, and this is totally not going to work for long-form content. What I would really like to see is the ability to say, hey, I want some columns. I'd like a row of columns that are like 80% of the viewport height. And then you scroll, and then you have another row of columns, and you scroll, and you have another row of columns, right? Anybody who has done graphic design in PageMaker, QuarkXPress, InDesign, you recognize that pattern, right? You make these boxes, and then you pour the content through the boxes. That would be awesome. There is a specification called CSS Regions that would allow us to do exactly that. There's a drawing that the folks over at Adobe made because they think it's awesome. It would totally be awesome. It's a little bit, it's not supported, and not only is it not supported, but there's a big debate about it. It was in Chrome, and Chrome yanked it out. I'm going to go hunt down the people and find out what's going on. I'll let you know next year what's up with Regions. I think we need it. Hopefully it will happen. So let's look at some more magazines. This set pays attention to the edges of the page. It's a big thing in magazine design, because you know where the edges of the page are. You've told the printer where you want them, and they cut them right there. I love this design. I mean, for years, I did a monthly magazine for 8 years, and we could never once afford full bleed pages. Look at that. It's a full bleed, full CMYK color page. You know what? The web is RGB, which is even better, and it's also full bleed. We don't use full bleed on the web very much, or we've started to, but it's just all hero graphics going from the top and the left and right edge. This is asymmetrical. Look at this asymmetrical half full bleed layout, right? Or here, these words are right up against the edge of the page. This depends on sort of being able to put things along the bottom edge of the page and cutting the page into two halves. Or putting this title right in the middle of the page with that extra, the metadata about the author down in the right-hand corner. It's been very hard to do these things on the web, because the web there isn't really a way to know where the edges of the page are. They're always in different places, and especially that bottom edge is very tricky. You have no idea where it is. But let's see if we could do this. Let's see if we could do something like this kind of design on the web. So we got here an example, a main element with an image and a headline and a paragraph, and I put a div around the headline and the paragraph so I can have a place to hook some more CSS. Let's float the image to the left and put a little bit of a margin on the right-hand side. Make the image 50% of the width of the space that we're in. Put a little bit of padding on that div. And what do you get? This looks exactly like that design. That's cool. Aren't we done? This is awesome, right? No. This is what the web has behaved like for the last 15 years. It's been impossible to control that bottom edge of the page, and we've paid dearly in design because of it. Well, let's remove the width of 50%, and let's add instead height 100VH. VH is a new unit that you might not have heard of. And let's see what happens. That photo is now pegged to 100% of the viewport height. VH stands for viewport height. And no matter what we do, that image is going to stay the height of that viewport. Let me add another line of width 50VW and also put a font size of 6VW on the H1. And let's look at what that does. So now that photo's 50% wide, 100% tall, and the words Grace Hopper are growing in proportion to the space that they're in without any JavaScript. I'm a big believer of not using JavaScript for layout. Just leave JavaScript out of this part of the web page. It doesn't work for a picture of a person because it doesn't constrain the aspect ratio, right? She gets all squishy. But you could use some sort of abstract photo, or I wanted you just to see what starts to be possible by using these viewport units. Let me show you another example here. I created a header and an H1, and then there's a bunch of stuff that's in an article, right? This is fairly simple markup. And let's put some CSS on it. I'm going to put a border on that header, a big thick border that you can see from the back row, and a yellow background and some padding. I'm also going to make that font just much bigger for the heck of it and put some centering on it. And let's see what happens. I'm going to add height 100VH to that header. That's the new code. So no matter what size screen the person is using when they land on your web page, this cover sheet is going to fill their screen completely. And then when they scroll, because you can still scroll, it doesn't get rid of scrolling, the 100VH, the article is right there underneath what they're doing. And I've seen this, I'm starting to see this actually crop up in a lot of places. This is one of them. The New York Times Magazine is using this very beautifully on their magazine articles, their big headline cover stories. And it really creates a kind of a cover. Instead of the magazine, what do you do with the paper magazine? There's a cover and this one giant article each week. How do you put that on the web? Well, the New York Times lab folks have been coming up with some really interesting ideas. This is a great translation of taking the sort of result of a physical paper cover and getting that result in a web page. So that when you land, you have this experience of like, okay, it's about to be something big. You haven't entered yet. Now, here we are, we're going to enter it. I would not want to see this on every single article on the New York Times, right? I don't want to see this on every startup product website. I don't want to see this with the 3 columns underneath. Like, I like this design because I think it fits a particular kind of content very well, and it's being used in that way very well. But these are viewport units. BH, VW, Vmin, and Vmax. Vmin, the browser will think and look at both width and height and pick the smaller of the two. Vmax, it assesses both of them and picks the larger of the two, which creates a whole other set of possibilities. It's part of the values and units, level 3 specification, and it's also very well supported. It's supported in Internet Explorer. The lighter green that you see on this slide is the Vmax and Vmin have a couple bugs in them in IE and the older versions of IE, so you might want to be aware of those. But otherwise, it's quite well supported. Yeah, viewport units. So let's look at this again, though, right? What about that centered title? Let me take off some of this, simplify it a bit. So we just make the headline shorter and take off the centering and the padding, so now it's just in the place where it always is by default, which is in the upper left-hand corner. And I'm going to add display flex to the header and a margin auto to the H1. And this is what you get. Display flex redefines what margin auto does. Margin auto now not only works in the horizontal direction, it also works in the vertical direction. And so you get this. Something centered on a website. It's amazing. But I could take off that margin auto and instead use align item centered and justified content center, get the same exact result, the thing in the middle. Or we can say justify items flex end, justify content flex end, which basically is saying, please put this at the end of the order of things which in this case is the bottom right corner, but you might be using a language that goes right to left instead of left to right, or you might have swapped your direction of your flex. Instead of it being a horizontal, it might be vertical. Flexbox is kind of, you can do all sort of spins in all sorts of different dimensions. Thus, the words of things like flex end. But it would put those words down in the bottom. We could add a little bit of, we could put the title in the middle and put the author information in the bottom corner. Really nice. Flexbox. Flexbox is absolutely amazing. There's a lot being written about it right now. It's going to take us all a couple years to wrap our heads completely around it. But it's time to use it. 93% of people using the internet have support for Flexbox. Great progressive enhancement techniques will support the other 7%. So you can totally use it today. Chris Coyer has a CSS Tricks Complete Guide to Flexbox, which I use a lot. I recommend it. Check it out. It's cool. It's a good cheat sheet when you sort of kind of remember how to do it, but you totally don't. You need to like quickly look it up again. But he's got these great diagrams that show you sort of some of the things that are possible. Like you can line things up along the baseline of the text. Or you can line them up flex end, which reminds me of that Wired magazine where things are not lined up on the top of the columns. Space between, you can actually say, I want this row to be at the top of the space that we have, and I want this other row to be at the bottom of the space that we have, and then take how many other rows are in the middle and evenly space them out in a vertical way. Things that we've never been able to do before. Of course, the first thing we're going to do is a lot of filling in the gaps and closing the pain points on the designs that we already do, right? Like how many people have ever, and how many of the front-end developers in the room have ever gotten a PDF emailed to you where somehow magically all the content is exactly the same as lengthwise as all the other content? Every title has 5 words. Every teaser is 3 lines. Magically. Right, you're supposed to put a drop shadow around a box and a drop shadow around each of these boxes, and they're supposed to all just like, and you're like, that's not how it works. It's not print, stop it. Like, you don't have to have that conversation anymore because you can use Flexbox for that layout, and Flexbox will just figure out, oh, okay, on this row, this piece of content has the biggest amount of stuff. So this box needs to be this tall for that. OK, we'll make everything in the row be that same height. But then in this row, the biggest content is actually much smaller. So every box on that row can be smaller. Really beautiful. It just works. Here I've used Flexbox in a really small way. I suggest doing that with some of these things. It can be overwhelming to figure out how to change everything. So don't change everything. Change one little small thing. Down in the corner, there are these filed under categories, right? Click and you can go see all the shows in that category. But instead of having, you know, responsive web design is on 2 lines and performance and DevOps is on 1 line, but instead of having those lined up in your classic way where the top line of each of those would be matched, the shorter one lines up to the center of the taller one. Tiny detail that probably nobody's noticed, but I love little things like that. And it's getting my skills up so I can start using them in bigger ways too. I can't leave you without talking about grids, of course, right? Grids. CSS Grid Layout is a new specification that's coming. You've probably heard about it. Everybody is completely out of their mind excited about this thing. That's the name of it. It's still in working draft, although this might be out of date. I don't know. It's moving so fast, it's hard to keep up. Rachel Andrews is writing about this a lot. I highly recommend following her and finding her and reading her tutorials. This is what it looks like. I just read out of her blog post. Here's some screenshots of her tutorial. Basically, instead of using something like 960 Grid or Bootstrap or outsourcing, I mean, that's what we've been doing, right? We've wanted to use grids. A lot of us have been using 12-column and 16-column grids over and over again. All 12 columns are the same width as each of the other columns, right? And you just use this sort of framework, and you're like, you don't have to write the CSS and troubleshoot it and bug. You don't get any errors coming back from QA, bug reports about how it's broken in IE6, because it's not, because somebody else wrote that code and you don't understand it. You just let them deal with it, right? You use their code so you don't have to have the problems. Because it was hard. It was very hard to write floats for old browsers. So instead of doing any of that, you'll be able to use your own code and write your own stuff very easily. So here, display grid Instead of using display block or display flex, it's display grid. And then you define, this is on the wrapper, right, so the container of the whole layout. You define your columns. You say, I have a bunch of columns. Here they are. I want lines at these places. And then you also can define rows, which we've never been able to do before, to actually have a grid of rows. And then you say, OK, I've got this block of content or this module of content. I want it to go from start at 2 and go to 3. That's familiar, right, for some of these grid systems. But also for the rows, you can say, I want it to start at 2 and go to 3 or go to 4. It's not well supported yet at all. But look which browser had it first. It's a new day in Microsoft. It really is. It's totally seriously is. Basically, this spec got invented in Internet Explorer. At the moment, the best implementation is in Chrome, and that is simply because IE had the earliest implementation, and now it's out of date because things have changed. But they're totally updating it right now. It's in Chrome behind a flag, so if you want to try it out, use Chrome, turn on the experimental flag feature. That way you can write code and you can try it out. You can't put it out into the world because no one else has their flag turned on, but you can see what it's doing. But meanwhile, all 4 browser makers, I've talked to people at all of them, are working on this so quickly. Like, it's going to ship first quarter next year. It's going to come out, all 4, boom, 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 boom. It's going to be in Chrome, Firefox, and Internet Explorer very quickly, and Safari, I don't know, whenever they're able to ship it. The code is being written. I don't know, maybe they'll have to wait till the fall before it ships, but it's going to come very fast. And it's going to change the way that we do layouts, and it's going to make a whole lot of things possible that weren't possible before. But meanwhile, we are using old school floats for layout. And I want to talk a little bit about dynamic grids. Mark Bolton has been talking about this for years. He was on the Web Ahead in 2011 in episode 9. And Nathan Ford wrote this article on A List Apart that's pretty great. It's got these great diagrams in it, where basically, if you look at print design and you look at grids in print design, there are all sorts of situations where people have used a golden ratio to do the math on a bunch of columns, or they're using other kinds of ways of thinking about grids, using odd numbers of columns, like 7 or 9 columns, instead of always using 12. Now that we don't have to do all those, the tools aren't nearly as hard, so we're able to do something more complex. And here, if you look at the top row, Nathan says, an even-sized array of images is orderly and sturdy. A golden ratio-based array in the middle feels organic and dynamic. Or on the bottom, a chaotic array is interesting and a bit unnerving. You can do art direction through your layout, your grid layout, your grid system. We've all been doing orderly and sturdy because we don't know what else to do. Just out of habit, just because somebody else did. Because we read a blog post that said, hey, you should divide by 12. So we're like, okay. 10 years later, I'm still dividing by 12. There's some very, very interesting things that you can do if you shake this up. GridSet app is a great tool for doing this if you're interested, because it gets to be very like, how do I design a grid that's a 7-column golden ratio grid? With my ruler and my calculator. You can use this tool instead. It's a whole WYSIWYG system. You can like drag things around and design the whole grid. And then when you're done, you can put a framework that you can use so that you don't have to write the CSS. It works a lot like some of the other frameworks in implementation. I use this on the Web Ahead. You can actually go to the Web Ahead website, and at the bottom there's a little note in the footer, or you can hit Apple G, and it will bring the grid up, this set of yellow lines, and you can kind of see my grid, how I used it, how it changes at different breakpoints, and you can take a look. Do you like it? Do you not like it? Do you think it's cool? Do you think it's stupid? See what you think of it. So here's the question, all the stuff I rapid-fired at you, right? This is what you're thinking. When can I use this on a real website? Or why did you totally tell me about this stuff I can't use yet? And I'm going to ask you a question back. Do websites need to look exactly the same in every browser? No. Eric, spoiler alert, just told us no, and you can confirm that answer by going to do websites need to look exactly the same in every browser.com. No. And this came out when CSS3 was a thing, and we were talking about using rounded corners in CSS instead of making these insanely painful sprites of lots and lots of corners, right? If you look at this in IE6 or IE5 or Netscape 3, right, it still says no. It just looks different. You get a different font. Maybe you get Helvetica or Georgia instead of this fancy font. Remember, the drop shadow is missing. The translucency on the little thing is not there. But you still get the content. You still get the word no, right? So progressive enhancement really is about making sure that you think through, well, what is it that's important, and how can I make sure that that gets delivered? And then these other things that aren't necessarily important. So like that shape being a circle instead of a square, not totally important. What's important is that they can read the bio and they can see the photo. And you can, whether the shape is a square or a circle, that text wrapped around. So a lot of these things, here's a great example, right? So IE8 can't see Flexbox. You know what's really great about CSS? When a browser finds a line of CSS it doesn't understand, it just ignores it. So IE, there's something further up in the cascade that says, hey, this element is going to be display block. IE8 is reading through the code. It sees display flex, FL. That's not how you spell block. I don't know what that word is. You meant block. I'm going to ignore the word flex. And it just keeps going. So you'll get what's on the left in IE8, while the same exact code base will create what's on the right in the browsers that do understand Flexbox. So if you're thoughtful about the way you write your CSS, you're careful about what you're doing, if you want it to be display block, then double check and make sure that it is. If it turns out that it's display inline or display something else, then write a line of code that says display block, and then immediately replace it with a line of code that says display flex. And the browsers that understand display flex will render it as display flex, and the browsers that don't will render it as display block, and you'll be fine. You don't have to hold, maybe that 2% or 5%, or for you it could be 80% of people who are using Internet Explorer 8 or 7 or 6 or 3. You don't have to hold your whole audience hostage and never give anyone something new until there are 0% people using an old browser. You can stack up your code so that 2% of your people get the experience on the left, while 98% of the people get the experience on the right, and it's fine. Totally works fine. It can be a little bit harder with something like the whole page layout, so you got to be careful and thoughtful, but it is possible to do that. So when can I use this? 5 years ago, you could have used rotation, multi-column layout, and dynamic grids. Last year, you could have used Shapes, Flexbox, and Viewport Units. I recommend all 3 of those. You really can use them today with some well-written code. It's totally fine. Later, we'll have Shapes Level 2, Grid Layout, and a thing called Exclusions, which I didn't talk about today, but it's also pretty awesome. Uncertain regions, hopefully. I'm crossing my fingers. And there's some other stuff that I may or may not have mumbled about: fragmentation, figures, overflow. There's a new one called Round. Came out like, I don't know, 6 days ago. It's put things in circles. We'll see. This is going to keep going. We're going to just keep getting more and more different kinds of CSS specifications that are going to support layouts. And when I first heard about them, I thought, oh, they're conflicting with each other. There's a competition. These people aren't talking together. And that's not the case at all. A lot of the people who've written these specs are the same people who wrote the other specs. They're very complementary. They work together. And we're just going to have more and more of them come online, and we're going to be able to use them. And it's going to get very interesting combining them and trying new things out, going from one to the other. But the hardest part really isn't changing our CSS. It's changing our thinking. Because we could do the same old boring layouts with some new code, but I'm bored with that already. It hasn't even happened yet. I'm already bored. So how are we really going to change our thinking? I think we can look outside the web industry for inspiration and to figure out where it is we want to go. Vogue, by the way, redesigned after I took those screenshots. And the image of the bear and the model now looks like this. It's a retina image. Gorgeous resolution. You can see all kinds of detail. They wrote a different caption that's actually much better. They got rid of the double name. I mean, I don't know how hard they must have worked to redo their content. It's great. It's much better. And I've been looking at books like these to find all kinds of different layouts and just get inspiration. We can think about how layout can convey voice and tone like this one does, or how layout can serve the content, how layout can create something that's unexpected, create a surprise. But we do want to remember the lessons that we learned when we finally got it into our thick heads that the web is not print. We need to translate ideas that we find other places, and not transfer them. Ideas from wherever, architecture, sculpture. Find ways to translate them into our medium, which is a different medium, a new medium, its own medium. For one big difference, the print works like this in this country and many others. You've got pages you're flipping from left to right, where the web is scrolling. There's a basic, obvious, you got to remember that, right? Like, so any sort of layout needs to morph to work in this format rather than a page-turning format. We also have no idea what size our screen is, right? We're not designing a specific fixed width, bottom edge fixed piece of paper. We're designing something that's crazy, flexible, fluid, morphing, responsive. You really don't know what it's going to be. And you want to design something that's going to work in that kind of three-dimensional, four-dimensional world. And most of us are working on content management systems. Most of us are designing for a system. We're not designing bespoke one-off web pages. And you don't know how long your content is going to be. As Karen McGrain said a couple years ago, truncation is not a content strait. You can't just chop the content. You can't just say, oh, well, this sentence is going to have 150 characters. Boop, too bad for you. You've got to design something so that when the headline is one word and the headline is 12 words, when the teaser is 150 characters and when the teaser is 400 characters, it's still going to work. That you've got that sort of, that's why I love designing in prototypes, designing in real HTML with real CSS, because that way I can just toss all kinds of weird edge case lengths of content at it and see what happens. What happens when you have a landscape shaped photo and then you have a portrait shaped photo next to each other? If that's not going to work, what are you going to do in your content system, in your content strategy, and all the employees that work adding content to the system? What are you going to build into your content management system to create the constraints that you need? To me, that's part of the design process. It's part of the layout design process. It's something that you really need to think through and talk to everybody through, the whole team, to figure out. Because without that, you really can't do great layout work. But this is a time to experiment. It's a time to create demos and to play and to discover, to write blog posts, like Jeffrey said. If you're a developer, I suggest making some examples and showing them to your designers and showing them to other people on your team. Because they're not going to suddenly start designing something awesome because you know how to code it. Sadly, that's not how it works. But if you could, even on the weekends, if that's what it takes, code something up, make some sort of demo, put it on a tablet, walk into the office and be like, hey, did you know the web can do this? Look, it's a real web page with a circle on it, with a text wrapped around it. They will be excited. They will be excited, and they will ask you more, and you will be able to talk to them and work together to create these kinds of designs. If you're a designer, start making some prototypes. Start designing in code. And if you don't know any CSS or HTML, then find yourself a developer buddy who does, and team up and work together and see what you can make. It's really only through playing around that we're going to discover what's possible. But I want, most of all, for all of you to walk away no longer believing that this is what you should be doing when you go to design a website. I know a lot of friends who, new project, first thing they do is download a Visio template from 960.js, and then they start drawing boxes. This is not the only thing that we can do. This is not what we have to do. This might be what you do next week. This might be what you do for the rest of the next 6 months, because change is hard, it takes time. Don't feel bad about that. It's totally, you have my permission, it's okay. But a year from now, 2 years from now, 5 years from now, this is not gonna be what we're doing. This is not the thing. So, Grace Hopper famously said, the most dangerous phrase in the language is, we've always done it this way. I want to leave you with one last story. Bill Cunningham, you may know him from his videos on the New York Times website or his fashion photography column that's been printed in the newspaper for many, many years. There's a documentary about him called Bill Cunningham, New York. He's such a delightful man. It's a really fun listen to. Watch. What is it? What do you do with the film? Watch it. It's fun watching. But I wanted to leave you with this clip because he's explaining what layout means to him.
I would come after my job at the Times, and we would lay this out, and then I'd go home about 2 o'clock. Bike back from Soho, where we were.
I think One Details magazine, it was fall special, 125 pages of Bill Cunningham.
100 pages? 99 pages. We never thought of it. We just went on and did what we wanted till we had said what we wanted to say.
111 pages.
111 pages. Here, what I did was I blew up the embroidery of the coat, and we put it on the pages, and then put the coat small in the middle of it. Because the news was in...
Yeah, the idea was this.
Because it was like something out of the Renaissance, you see? You try to show the reader what was really new. Look at this. It's like something from Paul Poiret, 1910, the Scheherazade, the Arabian Nights. Look at the embroidery, the tassels, the lace. Now, I mean, do you imagine the extravagance of these pages? And Annie Flanders never blinked. You can't say anything, Annie. I didn't take money, so I can do what I want.
We are the keepers of that legacy. Print is receding. So how can we give folks like those the tools that they need to do that kind of work, to keep doing that caliber of work? Where is it that we're going to go next? It's time to start tackling this question of what is going to be the next era of layout design on the web. Thank you.